Hi everyone. Since there was so much interest in the vlog I did around Halloween on sociopaths and psychopaths and that type of information, I thought I would do another one talking a little bit more about, since sociopath and psychopath are not diagnoses that we use anymore, where those sort of fit, specifically psychopathy, how we see that now as psychologists, and where that sits when we're talking about character traits, personality, that sort of thing. So interestingly, there's been some research into what they call a dark triad. So as psychologists, we have a list of different personality traits that, there's some theories about which traits make up the personalities that we see in everybody. And in most of the positively focused or neutrally focused theories, there's certain character traits that just don't seem to fit. And so researchers have taken those traits and put them into what we call a dark triad, which means the more dangerous, more negative personality traits that seem to exist within their own sphere. And so, for example, within the dark triad, we have Machiavellianism, and we have psychopathy, and we have narcissism. And so within that triad, having those different characteristics to different degrees will help us sort of figure out how do we place certain individuals when it comes to perhaps risk, or how do we predict certain types of reactions that a person may have if they're very high on one of these scales. So I'm going to start out with narcissism. Narcissism, most people are aware of narcissism as a character trait. It's a buzzword we use a lot today, and the reality is everybody needs a certain amount of narcissism. We have to have a certain amount of thought of ourselves, and we have to hold ourselves at a certain level of regard. So, people who, if you had no thought of self at all, then, we would not make choices in our best interest. They would always be in somebody else's. And so to be healthy, we need a certain amount. However, people who are more associated with the dark triad tend to have very high levels of narcissism, and they can be very malicious narcissists. So that means that they're likely to be violent, or they're likely to have an abusive reaction if they're not given the respect or the admiration or the things that they feel they deserve to have. So there's a negative aspect to narcissism that we attach to the dark triad. There's the positive part that we attach to kind of your everyday person. Also, there is Machiavellianism in the dark triad, and that is actually manipulation. So they've actually found Machiavellianism is higher in people who have higher IQs, which would make sense. I mean, if you can think a little faster, you can put things together faster, you can see connections that maybe other people can't see, you can use manipulation to get the situation to where you want it to be. And so a person high in Machiavellianism is going to use manipulation as their primary form of interacting with others so that they can get what they need from the interaction. Now, the final part of this, and why I really wanted to touch on it, is psychopathy. So psychopathy, as I mentioned before, is not a diagnosis, but it's more of a character trait. And in the dark triad, it's referred to as a lack of care or empathy for other people, a disregard for the rights of other people, a disinterest in other people really in general at all. And people can have different amounts of psychopathy. So some people do experience some empathy, but not a lot. And so they may have a general disregard for people, but there's certain things that, maybe they even wouldn't do. So they might understand that killing a person is not a good thing, so they kind of have a line somewhere that they don't cross. And we used to refer to those people as sociopaths, which are basically people who have the disregard that is associated with psychopathy, but they're able to stay within the laws of society, basically. Interestingly enough, a lot of people who are very successful CEOs, they tend to have high traits, or a high correlation with what used to be sociopathy, because they can exist within the rules of the world, but they can make those really hard decisions that those of us who are lower in, say, the psychopathy trait, or maybe have very little of it at all, we're going to feel really sad and really struggle with the idea of, say, cutting, I don't know, 400 people's jobs. Whereas somebody who's higher up on that scale, they might not be bothered by it whatsoever. They don't lose any sleep over it. It's just, yeah, this is what has to be done, so this is what we do. So you tend to find a high level of kind of that, what used to be sociopathy within the high level CEOs. Now with psychopathy, when you push it to the very end of the scale, then you're looking at your serial killers and people who take action without thinking it through in terms of, you know, what might this mean for another person. Usually they don't care. So when we're looking at some of the more well-known serial killers, like for example the Green River Killer is one that comes to mind. They have a very high level of psychopathy to the point where it's clinically problematic. And so putting these three together into a triad basically allows us to look at individuals and place them on the scale, and then hopefully as research progresses allows us to start to predict, you know, okay, should we keep an eye on this particular individual? Should we, you know, let this particular individual out of jail if they're very high on psychopathy, because the likelihood of reoffending is extremely high. So if this is their third time in jail, do we give them another chance? You know, so that's really the hope of being able to use the dark triad for things. It's also important to note that if we're going to apply a dark triad traits to a person, that we remember that we don't apply these to children, because children have a very different personality structure than adults, because they don't have the same level of self-regulation, of understanding of expectation, of reality, of the world around them. And so it takes time for them to develop. And we know that teenagers in general are very egocentric, very self-centered. They feel the world revolves around them. And that's something that they will grow out of. It's just adults who don't grow out of that, or who aren't able to then move on to considering the world as a whole, and they're kind of stuck in that egocentric, narcissistic type of thinking. That's when we start applying a dark triad to that. So hopefully that explains things a little bit. I find it fascinating, and there's more and more research out there on it. So hopefully as research progresses, it's something that will be useful in the future.